Picture this. You're sitting in the most prestigious xenobiology class in the galaxy, surrounded by beings from 100 different worlds. The air recyclers hum quietly as tentacled professors discuss theoretical predator-prey, relationships, in sanitized, academic terms. Everything is peaceful, controlled, safe. Then a human walks in. Not just any human, a Deathworlder. One of those terrifying bipeds from the nightmare planet called Earth, where everything tries to kill everything else, and somehow, impossibly, these creatures not only survived, but thrived. The classroom temperature seems to drop. Chitinous carapaces shiver. Crystalline beings dim their natural luminescence. But here's what nobody expected. The human isn't the most dangerous thing in that room. What happens next will shatter every assumption these alien students have about predators, survival, and what it truly means to be apex. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come not from textbooks or lectures, but from watching a Deathworlder do what Deathworlders do best, survive the impossible, and protect those who can't protect themselves. This is the story of how one human student turned a routine xenobiology class into a legend that would be whispered across star systems for generations. A tale of courage, quick thinking, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to yield, even when facing something that should, by all rights, be absolutely unstoppable. The galaxy was about to learn why Earth's children are called Deathworlders, and why sometimes that's exactly what you need. Marcus Chun had grown accustomed to being the subject of fearful whispers and nervous glances during his time at Kepler Interspecies University. As one of only 12 humans enrolled in the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution, he understood that his very presence unsettled many of his fellow students. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago, and their reputation as Deathworlders preceded them everywhere they went. The classification wasn't meant as a compliment. Most sentient species in the galaxy evolved on what humans would consider garden worlds, planets with stable climates, mild weather patterns, and ecosystems where cooperation rather than competition was the primary evolutionary driver. Earth, by contrast, was classified as a Class 12 death world, a designation reserved for planets so hostile that most galactic citizens couldn't comprehend how intelligent life could possibly emerge from such nightmarish conditions. Marcus pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders as he navigated the crystalline corridors of the xenobiology department. The environmental controls kept the atmosphere at a comfortable temperature for most species, but humans tended to run warmer than average, and the station's artificial climate always left him feeling slightly chilled. The soft bioluminescent lighting that other species found soothing cast strange shadows across the translucent walls, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that never quite felt natural to human eyes. As he approached Lecture Hall Sigma 7, Marcus could hear the familiar chittering and harmonious tones that indicated his classmates were already assembled. Professor Veltar's advanced xenobiology course was legendary throughout the university, not just for the Zalithian professor's encyclopedic knowledge of galactic life forms, but for her unconventional teaching methods. Where most professors relied on holographic displays and theoretical discussions, Veltar believed in hands-on learning experiences that often pushed the boundaries of university safety protocols. Marcus paused outside the lecture hall's entrance, taking a moment to mentally prepare himself for the inevitable reaction to his arrival. Through the transparent aluminum doors, he could see the familiar sight of his 43 classmates arranged in the semicircular seating arrangement that Professor Veltar preferred. The diversity never ceased to amaze him, even after 2 years at KIU. Near the front, 3 Zilithians sat in their characteristic meditation pose, their tall, slender frames perfectly still except for the gentle swaying of the sensory tendrils that crowned their elongated heads. Their silver-blue skins seemed to shimmer under the lecture hall's soft lighting, and Marcus knew that beneath their peaceful exterior, their highly evolved empathic abilities were constantly monitoring the emotional states of everyone around them. Behind them, a cluster of Corvin's students huddled together in what humans might mistake for fear, but which Marcus had learned was actually their species' natural social configuration. The insectoid beings' chitinous exoskeletons gleamed like polished obsidian, and the soft clicking sounds they made were actually a complex form of chemical communication that supplemented their verbal speech. The Etherians occupied their usual position near the back of the room, their crystalline bodies refracting the ambient light into beautiful rainbow patterns across the walls and ceiling. As beings composed of living mineral matrices, they communicated through harmonic resonances that most other species experienced as hauntingly beautiful music. Scattered throughout the seating area were representatives of a dozen other species. The tentacled Aquarians in their specialized moisture suits, the diminutive but brilliant Tecton engineers with their cybernetic implants, and the imposing Thurian warriors whose massive frames required specially reinforced seating. Marcus touched the door's activation sensor, and the entrance dissolved with barely a whisper of displaced air. The effect on the classroom was immediate and dramatic. Conversations died mid-sentence. Harmonic resonances shifted to minor keys, and dozens of alien eyes turned toward him with mixtures of curiosity and barely concealed apprehension. He had learned not to take it personally. Humans were an anomaly in the galactic community, a species that had emerged from conditions so extreme that most other races struggled to comprehend how they had survived, let alone develop civilization. The fact that humans could function normally in environments that would kill most galactic citizens within minutes was both fascinating and terrifying to his fellow students. "Ah, Mr. Chun." Professor Veltar's melodious voice carried easily across the sudden silence. "Perfect timing. Please, take your usual seat. We were just about to begin today's practical demonstration." Marcus nodded respectfully to the professor, a graceful Zilithian whose advanced age was evidenced by the deep blue coloration of her sensory tendrils and the intricate silver patterns that traced across her translucent skin. Unlike many of her species, Professor Veltar had always treated him with genuine warmth and curiosity rather than fearful respect. As he made his way to his customary seat in the middle section of the amphitheater, Marcus was acutely aware of the way conversations gradually resumed around him, but in hushed tones and with frequent glances in his direction. 2 years of this routine hadn't made it any less isolating, but he had learned to focus on the positive aspects of his unique situation. Today, class, we will be examining the fascinating relationship between predator and prey species across different planetary classifications, Professor Veltar announced as Marcus settled into his seat. As I'm sure you're all aware, the vast majority of inhabited worlds in our galaxy fall into the Class 1 through Class V categories, where environmental pressures favor cooperative evolution and symbiotic relationships. A holographic display materialized in the center of the lecture hall, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with thousands of inhabited systems marked in various colors. The overwhelming majority glowed with the soft green light that indicated garden worlds, while scattered clusters of yellow, orange, and red markers represented progressively more hostile planetary classifications. However, the professor continued, her tendrils swaying gently as she gestured toward the display. There are rare instances where intelligent life emerges from far more challenging environments. These so-called death worlds present us with fascinating evolutionary adaptations that challenge many of our fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and civilization. Marcus felt the familiar weight of dozens of stars as a single red marker appeared prominently in the display, representing Earth's position in the Solar System. He kept his expression neutral, having long since learned that any visible reaction would only fuel more speculation and whispered conversations about the mysterious human student in their midst. Today's practical demonstration will allow us to observe predator behavior in a controlled environment, Professor Veltar announced, her voice taking on the excited tone that always preceded her most memorable lessons. I have arranged for us to study a specimen that represents one of the most efficient predators known to galactic science. A murmur of nervous anticipation rippled through the assembled students. Professor Veltar's practical demonstrations were legendary for pushing the boundaries of safety and comfort, but they were also universally acknowledged as the most effective learning experiences available at the university. Now, before we begin, I must emphasize that this specimen has been carefully contained using the most advanced containment technology available. The professor continued, her tendrils darkening slightly in what Marcus had learned to recognize as a sign of serious concern. The biofield generators will ensure that there is absolutely no danger to any of you, but I do ask that you remain in your seats throughout the demonstration. Marcus felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. In his 2 years at KIU, he had learned that Professor Veltar's definitions of safe and contained often differed significantly from standard galactic protocols. Her willingness to expose students to genuinely dangerous situations in controlled environments was part of what made her classes so effective, but it also meant that every lesson carried an element of real risk. The specimen we will be observing today is a Vorthack shadow hunter, Professor Veltar announced, and the reaction from the class was immediate and dramatic. Several Corvin students emitted sharp chemical alarm signals that filled the air with the acrid scent of fear. The Ethereum's harmonic resonances shifted to dissonant frequencies that made the walls of the lecture hall vibrate ominously. Even the normally composed Zilithians showed signs of distress, their tendrils writhing in agitation. Marcus felt his own heart rate increase as he processed the implications of the professor's announcement. Vorthack shadow hunters were legendary throughout the galaxy as perhaps the most perfect predators ever encountered. Native to the nightmare world of Vorthack Prime, a Class 15 death world that made Earth look like a vacation resort, these creatures represented the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary optimization for hunting and killing. For those unfamiliar with this species, Professor Veltar continued, apparently oblivious to the waves of terror emanating from her students. The Vorthack shadow hunter is an apex predator that has remained virtually unchanged for over 50 million years. They possess adaptive camouflage that renders them effectively invisible to most forms of detection, natural psionic abilities that allow them to induce paralytic fear in their prey, and reflexes so fast that they can strike and kill most known species before their victims even realize they're under attack. The holographic display shifted to show a three-dimensional model of the creature in question, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Even rendered as a harmless projection, the Vorthack was a thing of nightmares. Roughly humanoid in shape, but standing nearly 3 meters tall, its elongated limbs ended in razor-sharp talons that looked capable of slicing through starship hulls. Its head was a grotesque fusion of predatory features from a dozen different evolutionary lineages, with 6 eyes arranged in a hexagonal pattern and a mouth filled with rows of serrated teeth. But it was the creature's skin that truly marked it as something from humanity's darkest fears. The Vorthax's hide was covered in microscopic chromatophores that could shift color and texture to match any environment instantly. In the holographic display, the creature's form seemed to flicker and phase, never quite solid, always seeming on the verge of disappearing entirely. The specimen has been in stasis for the past 72 hours to ensure its compliance during our observation period. Professor Veltar explained as a cylindrical containment unit began to rise from the floor in the center of the lecture hall. The biofield generators will maintain a barrier that the creature cannot penetrate, but this will allow us to observe its behavior patterns in a relatively natural state. Marcus found himself leaning forward in his seat despite his growing unease. As terrifying as the Vorthax was, he couldn't deny that this was an incredible opportunity to study one of the galaxy's most legendary predators. His human curiosity, that same drive that had led his species to explore dangerous environments and push the boundaries of survival, overrode his instinctive fear response. The containment cylinder was now fully extended, rising nearly 4 meters from the lecture hall floor and surrounded by the nearly invisible shimmer of the biofield generators. Inside the transparent aluminum walls, Marcus could see a dark, motionless shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Initiating revival sequence, Professor Veltar announced, her voice now carrying a note of genuine excitement. Please observe carefully as the specimen transitions from stasis to full consciousness. Note the immediate activation of its predatory instincts and the way it assesses its environment for potential threats and prey. A soft hum filled the lecture hall as the stasis field began to dissipate. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a movement so subtle that Marcus almost missed it, the dark shape within the cylinder shifted slightly. The Vorthax was awakening. Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense as his human survival instincts kicked into high gear. Unlike his classmates, who came from worlds where predators were rare and generally small, Marcus carried within his genes the accumulated evolutionary wisdom of a species that had survived millions of years on a planet filled with creatures that viewed humans as prey. The creature within the containment cylinder moved again, this time more definitively. Its form seemed to flow like liquid shadow, rising from its curled position to stand at its full, imposing height. As consciousness returned, the Vorthax's 6 eyes opened in sequence, each one focusing on the assembled students with the cold, calculating intelligence of a perfect killer. Around the lecture hall, the reaction was immediate and primal. Several students began to hyperventilate, their species' flight responses triggering automatic biochemical changes that prepared them for escape. The sweet scent of Corvin fear pheromones mixed with the acrid chemical signals of terror from a dozen other species, creating an olfactory cocktail that would have sent most galactic citizens into panic. But Marcus found himself studying the creature with a mixture of fear and fascination that was uniquely human. Yes, the Vorthax was terrifying beyond description. Yes, every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run. But he was also acutely aware that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a perfect predator in its element, demonstrating the kind of evolutionary optimization that had fascinated human scientists since they first began studying galactic biodiversity. The Vorthax completed its assessment of the room with unsettling speed, its 6 eyes moving in perfect coordination as it cataloged every potential threat and target. When its gaze fell on Marcus, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lecture hall's temperature. For just a moment, predator and human locked eyes across the barrier of the containment field, and Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. The creature tilted its head slightly, and Marcus realized that unlike his fellow students, he wasn't triggering the Vortex prey response. Instead, the ancient predator was studying him with the wariness of one apex predator encountering another. The moment was broken by a sound that would haunt Marcus's nightmares for years to come, a low, harmonious tone that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the lecture hall. It took him several seconds to realize that the sound was coming from the Vortex itself, and several more to understand what it meant. The creature was hunting. Professor Veltar's voice cut through the growing panic in the lecture hall, but there was a note of confusion that Marcus had never heard from her before. Fascinating. The specimen appears to be exhibiting behavior patterns I've never observed in previous studies. The harmonic vocalizations suggest it's attempting to use its psionic abilities despite the containment field. As if summoned by her words, the nearly invisible shimmer of the biofield generators began to flicker. Just for a moment, but long enough for Marcus to feel his heart skip a beat. The containment field was failing. Around him, his fellow students were too paralyzed by fear to notice the subtle signs that Marcus's human pattern recognition was picking up instinctively. The slight variations in the humming sound of the generators. The way the creature had positioned itself at the exact center of the cylinder. The calculating intelligence in those 6 alien eyes as it studied the walls of its prison. This wasn't just a predator awakening from stasis. This was a perfect killing machine systematically analyzing the weaknesses in its containment and preparing to exploit them. And Marcus was the only one who realized what was about to happen. The Vortex harmonic hunting call grew louder, and the biofield generator's flicker became more pronounced. Whatever the creature was doing, it was working. The most advanced containment technology in the galaxy was failing against a predator that had evolved on a world where such barriers would be just another obstacle to overcome. Marcus looked around the lecture hall at his fellow students, all of them frozen in terror or too alien to recognize the immediate danger they were facing. Professor Veltar was still speaking into her recording device, apparently convinced that the containment field would hold despite the increasingly obvious signs of its impending failure. For the first time since arriving at Kepler Interspecies University, Marcus felt the full weight of being a Deathworlder among Garden World inhabitants. They had never faced anything like this. They had no instinctive understanding of what it meant to be prey to something that existed only to hunt and kill. But Marcus did, and as the biofield generators gave another ominous flicker, he realized that very soon he was going to have to prove why humans had earned their fearsome reputation throughout the galaxy. The Vortex Shadow Hunter was about to be free, and Marcus was the only thing standing between it and 43 defenseless students who had no idea what it meant to fight for survival. The real lesson was about to begin. The biofield generators gave one final, dramatic flicker before failing completely. The shimmer that had separated predator from prey vanished with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly, the Vortex Shadow Hunter was free in a lecture hall full of terrified students who had no concept of how to defend themselves against a perfect killer. The creature's response was instantaneous and terrifying. Its form seemed to blur as its adaptive camouflage activated, making it nearly invisible against the crystalline walls of the lecture hall. Only the displacement of light and the soft whisper of movement betrayed its position as it began to move with the fluid grace of something that had never known defeat. Around Marcus, chaos erupted. The Corvin students emitted piercing shrieks of chemical terror that sent waves of acrid scent through the air. Several Etherian crystalline beings shattered their harmonic resonances into discordant noise that made the walls vibrate ominously. The Zilithians, normally the most composed species in the galaxy, began emitting high-pitched distress calls that Marcus had never heard before. Professor Veltar's voice cut through the pandemonium, but for the first time since Marcus had known her, the renowned xenobiology professor sounded genuinely frightened. Emergency protocols activate. All students remain in your seats. Security team to lecture hall Sigma 7 immediately. But Marcus knew that security wouldn't arrive in time. KIU's emergency response teams were trained to handle academic accidents and minor diplomatic incidents, not apex predators from Class 15 Deathworlds. By the time they arrived, processed what they were facing, and formulated a response, the Vorthack would have completed its hunt. The creature had positioned itself near the rear of the lecture hall, and Marcus could see its strategy unfolding with terrifying clarity. It was using the panic and chaos to mask its movements while it selected its first target. The Vorthack's hunting pattern was as elegant as it was deadly. It would eliminate the weakest prey first, using their deaths to create even more terror and confusion before moving on to progressively stronger targets. Its first victim would be Zixura, a diminutive Tecton engineering student whose cybernetic implants were sparking wildly as her species' fight-or-flight response overloaded her artificial neural networks. The small, rabbit-like being was closest to the Vorthack's position and completely paralyzed by fear, making her an ideal first kill. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him as he watched the nearly invisible predator stalking toward the helpless student. For 2 years, he had worked hard to suppress the aggressive instincts that made other species fear humans. He had practiced meditation techniques taught by Zilithian counselors, undergone behavioral modification therapy, and constantly monitored his own reactions to ensure that he never displayed the predatory behaviors that marked his species as dangerous. But watching a perfect killer prepare to slaughter an innocent student who trusted that the university's safety protocols would protect her triggered something primal in Marcus's human DNA. The same evolutionary programming that had allowed his ancestors to survive ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and countless other planetary catastrophes suddenly asserted itself with overwhelming force. Marcus stood up. The movement was so sudden and decisive that it cut through the chaos like a blade. The Vorthack froze mid-stalk, its 6 eyes immediately focusing on this new threat. Around the lecture hall, panicked students paused in their terror to stare at the human who had just done the unthinkable. He had drawn the attention of a Vorthack shadow hunter voluntarily. "Hey," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the kind of aggressive confidence that made several nearby students flinch instinctively. "Looking for something challenging, or are you just going to pick on someone who can't fight back?" The effect on the Vorthack was immediate and profound. The creature's camouflage flickered as its nervous system processed this unprecedented response. In millions of years of evolution on Vorthack Prime, nothing had ever challenged a shadow hunter directly. Prey animals fled or froze in terror. Other predators yielded territory rather than risk confrontation. The concept of something actively seeking combat with a Vorthack was so alien that the creature's hunting algorithms couldn't process it. Marcus took advantage of the creature's confusion to move. With the fluid grace that came from a childhood spent in Earth's gravity and a lifetime of physical activity that most galactic species couldn't even attempt, he vaulted over the seats between him and the lecture hall's center aisle. His landing was silent despite the distance, and He began moving toward the Vorthack with the focused intensity of a human who had decided that something needed to die. Marcus, no. Professor Veltar's voice was sharp with terror. Return to your seat immediately. You don't understand what you're facing. But Marcus understood perfectly. He was facing something that had never encountered a species that evolved alongside creatures just as dangerous as itself. The Vorthack was optimized to hunt prey that would flee or submit. It had no experience dealing with something that would fight back with intelligence, creativity, and the kind of stubborn refusal to yield that characterized every successful predator species. The Vorthack's hunting call changed pitch, becoming lower and more threatening. Its camouflage shifted to a more visible spectrum, revealing the full horror of its alien anatomy. Standing at nearly 3 meters tall, with limbs that seemed too long for any earthly concept of proportion, it was a creature designed by evolution to be the perfect expression of death. Marcus felt his human physiology responding to the threat exactly as millions of years of evolution had programmed it to. His heart rate increased, flooding his system with adrenaline. His pupils dilated to gather more light. His muscle fibers contracted, preparing for explosive movement. Most importantly, his human brain began running tactical calculations at a speed that would have impressed military strategists throughout the galaxy. The Vorthack was fast, but it had evolved to hunt creatures that were slower than humans. It was strong, but its strength was optimized for piercing and slashing attacks rather than the crushing force that human muscles could generate. It was intelligent, but its intelligence was focused entirely on hunting patterns that wouldn't work against something that refused to behave like prey. Most critically, the Vorthack had never faced anything that could think creatively under pressure. Its hunting techniques were perfect, but they were also completely predictable to a species that had survived by learning to think like predators. Marcus stopped moving when he was still 6 meters away from the creature, just outside what he estimated to be its maximum striking distance. The positioning was deliberate, close enough to be threatening, far enough away to react to an attack, and positioned so that any charge from the Vorthack would have to cross an open area where its camouflage would be less effective. "Come on, then," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm confidence that made several students wonder if humans might actually be more dangerous than they had previously believed. "Let's see what you've got." The Vorthack tilted its head in a gesture that was almost curious. Its 6 eyes studied Marcus with an intensity that seemed to burn, and, for a moment, Marcus felt the full weight of its psionic abilities pressing against his consciousness. The creature was trying to induce the paralyzing fear that made its hunts so effortless. But human brains were different from those of Garden World species. Where most galactic citizens had evolved in environments where cooperation and emotional sensitivity were survival advantages, humans had developed neural structures that could function effectively under extreme stress. The Vorthack's psionic assault felt like pressure behind Marcus's eyes, but it couldn't penetrate the kind of mental fortifications that millions of years of surviving natural disasters had bred into human consciousness. Marcus smiled, and the expression was nothing like the polite, careful smiles he had worn for 2 years of trying to fit in among species that feared him. This was the smile of something that had decided to embrace its nature as an apex predator. It was the smile his ancestors had worn when facing down saber-toothed cats, cave bears, and all the other nightmares that had tried to claim dominance over early humanity. The Vorthack's harmonic hunting call stuttered and died. For the first time in its species' evolutionary history, a shadow hunter was experiencing something it had never known before. Doubt. Marcus began moving again, but this time his movement was different. instead of the straightforward approach that prey animals might use in their desperation. He began circling the creature with a patient, predatory stalking pattern that every successful hunter learns instinctively. His steps were silent, his breathing controlled, and his eyes never left the vortex's center mass. The creature tried to counter his movement, turning to keep him in sight, but Marcus could see its confusion growing. The vortex's hunting patterns were optimized for tracking fleeing prey or cornering terrified victims. It had no experience with something that was actively hunting it in return. Around the lecture hall, the assembled students watched in stunned silence as their understanding of predator-prey relationships underwent a fundamental revision. For 2 years, they had thought of Marcus as dangerous because he came from a death world. Now, they were beginning to understand that he wasn't dangerous because of where he came from. He was dangerous because of what he was. Marcus continued his circling pattern, noting how the vortex's responses were becoming more erratic as its programming struggled to cope with this unprecedented situation. The creature's camouflage flickered randomly. Its head movements became jerky and uncertain, and, most tellingly, it had stopped making any sound at all. It was afraid. The realization hit the assembled students like a physical blow. The perfect predator, the nightmare from the deepest reaches of space, the creature that had never known defeat in millions of years of evolution, was experiencing fear for the first time in its existence. And that fear was being caused by a human student who should, by all reasonable calculations, be dead already. Professor Veltar's voice broke the silence, but now it carried a note of wonder rather than terror. Impossible. The specimen's bio readings indicate genuine distress. Its hunting protocols appear to be failing completely. Marcus heard her words, but his attention was focused entirely on the vortex. He could see the moment when the creature's ancient programming finally provided it with a solution to its dilemma. If stalking wasn't working, if psychological warfare was ineffective, if its prey refused to behave like prey, then there was only one option remaining: direct assault. The vortex launched itself at Marcus with a speed that turned it into little more than a blur of motion. Its razor-sharp talons extended as it committed to an attack pattern that should have been instantly lethal to any known form of life. But Marcus was ready. His human reflexes, honed by millions of years of surviving encounters with creatures that moved just as fast, triggered a response that seemed to violate several laws of physics. Instead of trying to dodge backwards like most prey animals would, Marcus stepped forward and to the side, moving inside the creature's striking radius where its long limbs couldn't generate maximum force. The vortex's talons passed through empty air as Marcus ducked beneath its reaching arms and drove his shoulder into the creature's midsection with the full force of human bone density and muscle fiber. The impact sent both of them tumbling across the lecture hall floor, but Marcus had planned for this outcome. As they fell, he wrapped his arms around the vortex's central torso and used their combined momentum to execute a throwing technique that would have been familiar to any human who had studied wrestling or martial arts. The move was impossible for most galactic species, who lacked the bone density and muscle coordination required for such aggressive physical manipulation. The vortex hit the floor hard, its alien anatomy unprepared for impact forces that weren't part of its normal hunting routine. For a moment, both predator and human lay still, and every student in the lecture hall held their breath. Then Marcus rolled to his feet with the fluid grace of something that had been throwing and being thrown since childhood, while the vortex struggled to right itself with movements that seemed almost clumsy by comparison. The perfect predator was learning what humans had always known: Sometimes the best defense against a superior force was to refuse to play by the rules that force expected you to follow. The real fight was just beginning, and Marcus was starting to understand why the galaxy feared Deathworlders. The Vord hack regained its footing with a fluid motion that reminded Marcus why these creatures were considered the apex predators of the galaxy. Despite the unexpected setback, its movements were still impossibly graceful, and the 6 alien eyes that tracked his every motion held an intelligence that was rapidly adapting to this new type of encounter. Marcus could see the creature's hunting algorithms recalibrating in real time. Its initial assessment had been wrong. He wasn't prey that could be overwhelmed with speed and fear. The Vorthax's posture shifted subtly as it began treating him as a legitimate threat rather than just another victim to be harvested. This development was both encouraging and terrifying. On one hand, Marcus had successfully disrupted the creature's standard hunting pattern and forced it to acknowledge him as an equal predator. On the other hand, that meant he was now facing something that would use its full capabilities rather than just its routine killing techniques. The creature's camouflage flickered and stabilized in a new configuration that Marcus had never seen before. Instead of trying to blend with the background, the Vorthax skin began displaying a complex pattern of shifting colors and textures that seemed to writhe and flow across its alien anatomy. The effect was deeply unsettling, and Marcus realized that this was probably a threat display evolved for intimidating other predators rather than hunting prey. Around the lecture hall, his fellow students watched in stunned silence. Many of them had never witnessed actual violence before, coming from species and worlds where conflict was rare and usually resolved through negotiation or social pressure. The sight of 2 apex predators sizing each other up for mortal combat was completely outside their evolutionary experience. Professor Veltar's voice carried across the space with clinical fascination overriding her earlier terror. Remarkable. The specimen appears to have shifted to an entirely different behavioral mode. I'm recording patterns I've never seen documented in the literature. Marcus didn't have time to appreciate the academic significance of what he was experiencing. The Vorthax had completed its threat display and was beginning to move again, but this time its approach was completely different. Instead of the straightforward stalk it had used before, the creature began weaving from side to side in a hypnotic pattern that made it difficult to focus on its exact position. Human pattern recognition systems evolved to track moving targets through dense forests and across varied terrain, allowed Marcus to see through the deception. The Vorthax's movement wasn't random. It was following a specific mathematical progression that was designed to confuse visual tracking systems. But the mathematics were based on how most galactic species processed visual information, and human brains work differently. Marcus began moving in response, but instead of trying to match the creature's weaving pattern, he moved in a straight line toward what his brain calculated would be the Vorthax position 3 seconds in the future. It was a technique human hunters had used for millions of years, leading the target rather than following it. The Vorthax's 6 eyes widened in what might have been surprise as Marcus's trajectory intersected its path exactly where his calculations had predicted. The creature tried to adjust, but it was committed to its movement pattern and couldn't change direction quickly enough. They collided with bone-jarring force, but this time Marcus was prepared for the impact. Instead of trying to wrestle the much larger creature to the ground, he used the momentum to deliver a strike that would have been impossible for most galactic species to execute. Human fists were unique in the galaxy. Dense bone formations backed by incredibly powerful muscle groups, and designed specifically for delivering crushing impacts. Most species had evolved hands for manipulation, communication, or environmental interaction. Only humans had developed appendages that were optimized for causing trauma to other living things. Marcus's punch connected with the center of the Vorthack's thorax with the force of a kinetic weapon. The impact sent shock waves through the creature's alien anatomy and produced a sound like breaking glass as something important ruptured inside its torso. The Vorthack stumbled backwards, its harmonic vocalizations shifting to frequencies that Marcus's human ears couldn't fully process, but which felt like ice water running down his spine. It was a sound of pain and rage combined, and it told him that his attack had been successful. But it also told him that he had just made this fight much more dangerous for everyone in the lecture hall. The creature's threat display intensified dramatically, and Marcus realized that what he had interpreted as intimidation tactics was actually a warning system for other Vorthacks. The patterns flowing across its skin were communicating complex information about the threat it was facing and requesting assistance from any other members of its species in the area. Fortunately, this was an academic institution rather than the creature's natural habitat, so no reinforcements would be coming. Unfortunately, the distress signals were also triggering combat protocols that the creature probably hadn't used since its youth on the nightmare world of Vorthack Prime. The Vorthack's camouflage shifted again, this time taking on properties that Marcus had never seen before. Instead of simply matching the background, the creature's skin began generating complex optical illusions that made it appear to be in multiple positions simultaneously. It was like looking at something through fractured glass, with each reflection showing a slightly different location and pose. Marcus felt a moment of genuine uncertainty as his human visual processing systems struggled to cope with sensory input that violated basic assumptions about how light and matter interacted. The Vorthack had evolved this capability specifically for fighting other predators, and it was incredibly effective against anything that relied on vision for tracking targets. But humans had evolved on a world where visibility could change instantly due to weather, terrain, or time of day. They had learned to use all of their senses for survival, not just sight. Marcus closed his eyes and focused on what his other senses were telling him. The sound of the creature's breathing, slightly labored now due to the internal damage his punch had caused. The subtle displacement of air currents as it moved. Most importantly, the scent markers that every living thing produced and which human olfactory systems were surprisingly good at detecting when properly focused. Marcus opened his eyes just as the Vorthack launched another attack, but this time he was ready for its advanced camouflage. His strike intercepted the creature's reaching arm with surgical precision, grabbing its wrist and using its own momentum to redirect its attack into the crystalline wall of the lecture hall. The impact sent spiderweb cracks racing across the transparent aluminum surface, and several students cried out in alarm as they realized that the forces being unleashed in their classroom were sufficient to damage the station's structure. This wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. It was a fight between two species that had been shaped by millions of years of survival in environments where the stakes were always life and death. The Vorthack's arm was trapped momentarily in the fractured wall, giving Marcus an opportunity that he couldn't afford to waste. Human beings were tool users by nature, and 2 years of trying to suppress those instincts hadn't eliminated millions of years of evolutionary programming. Marcus grabbed a broken piece of the crystalline wall material, hefting it with the practiced ease of someone whose species had been using improvised weapons since before recorded history. The fragment was roughly the size and weight of a hand axe, and its fractured edges were sharp enough to cut through most materials. The Vorthack freed its arm and spun to face him, but Marcus was already in motion. The throwing technique he used was as old as humanity itself, an overhand strike that maximized both accuracy and impact force. The crystalline fragment struck the creature dead center in its six-eyed facial cluster with devastating effect. Alien blood, dark purple and thick as syrup, splattered across the lecture hall floor. The Vorthack's harmonic vocalizations became a shriek of pain and rage that made the remaining intact windows vibrate ominously. Several of its eyes were obviously damaged, and its coordination was visibly impaired as its sensory input became confused and contradictory. But the injury also triggered something in the creature that Marcus hadn't expected. Instead of becoming more cautious or trying to retreat, the Vorthack entered what could only be described as a berserker rage. Its movements became faster and more aggressive, its attacks more wild and unpredictable. Marcus realized that he had just learned something new about Vorthack behavioral patterns that wasn't in any textbook. When seriously injured, these perfect predators didn't retreat to fight another day. They committed everything to ensuring that whatever had hurt them died with them. The creature's next assault was unlike anything it had attempted before. Instead of trying to use precision strikes or tactical movement, the Vorthack simply charged straight at Marcus with all the force its massive frame could generate. Its remaining functional eyes were locked onto him with a kind of focused intensity that eliminated everything else from its awareness. Marcus had perhaps 2 seconds to react before nearly 3 meters of enraged alien predator crashed into him with enough force to crush most galactic species into paste. His human brain, running on pure adrenaline and millions of years of evolutionary programming, calculated options and discarded them with lightning speed. He couldn't dodge. The creature was too large and moving too fast. He couldn't block. Its mass was far greater than his. He couldn't retreat. There was nowhere to go in the confines of the lecture hall. But humans had faced larger, stronger predators before and survived by refusing to think like prey animals. Instead of trying to avoid the collision, Marcus did something that violated every rational instinct possessed by Garden World species. He attacked, dropping into a low stance that his ancestors would have recognized from their encounters with charging megafauna. Marcus drove himself forward to meet the Vorthack's charge head-on. At the last possible moment, he dove beneath the creature's reaching arms and drove his shoulder into the lowest point of its center of gravity. The biomechanics of the collision were violent and spectacular. Marcus's compact human frame, dense bones, and powerful musculature struck the Vorthack's injured midsection with kinetic force that transferred the creature's own momentum back into its damaged internal organs. The impact lifted the massive predator completely off the ground and sent it crashing into the lecture hall's holographic projection equipment with a sound like a building collapsing. Sparks showered down as sophisticated computer systems worth more than most planets' annual budgets were reduced to expensive scrap metal. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems registered catastrophic damage and initiated safety protocols. In the sudden semi-darkness, Marcus rolled to his feet and took stock of the situation. The Vorthack was down, but not dead. Its breathing labored, and its movements sluggish but still purposeful. Several of its limbs appeared to be broken, and the dark purple blood flowing from its wounds was pooling on the lecture hall floor. Around him, 43 alien students sat in stunned silence, their understanding of predator-prey relationships fundamentally altered by what they had just witnessed. The human they had feared for 2 years had just demonstrated exactly why their fear had been justified, but also why that same capacity for violence could be directed toward protection rather than aggression. Professor Veltar's voice was barely a whisper, filled with academic wonder and personal terror in equal measure. Impossible. The specimen has been neutralized by a single individual using nothing but primitive kinetic force. This contradicts everything we know about Vorthack combat capabilities. Marcus didn't respond immediately. His attention was focused on the injured creature, watching for signs that it might still pose a threat. Human survival instincts warned him that wounded predators were often more dangerous than healthy ones, and he wasn't ready to assume the fight was over. But as he watched, the Vorthack's movements became increasingly uncoordinated. Whatever internal damage his attacks had caused was apparently severe enough to incapacitate even something evolved for perfect predatory efficiency. The creature's harmonic vocalizations faded to a barely audible whisper, and its 6 eyes lost their focused intensity. After millions of years of evolutionary perfection, a Vorthack shadow hunter had been defeated by something it had never encountered before, a species that refused to accept the role of prey. As emergency response teams finally arrived and began securing the scene, Marcus realized that his life at Kepler Interspecies University was about to change dramatically. His fellow students would never look at him the same way again, and news of what had happened would spread throughout the galactic community within hours. But for now, he was content to stand guard over his defeated opponent and ensure that his classmates remained safe. It was, he reflected, probably the most human thing he could do. The emergency response teams that flooded into Lecture Hall Sigma 7 represented the most advanced crisis management protocols in galactic civilization. Medical specialists from 6 different species worked to stabilize the injured Vorthack, while security personnel established containment barriers and safety perimeters. Academic officials documented every detail of the unprecedented incident, their instruments recording data that would revolutionize xenobiological understanding of predator behavior. But all of their sophisticated equipment and centuries of accumulated knowledge couldn't answer the question that dominated every conversation in the aftermath of the encounter. How had a single human student defeated something that should have killed him within seconds of first contact? Marcus found himself at the center of attention that made his previous social isolation seem pleasant by comparison. As medical scanners confirmed that he had somehow emerged from combat with a Vorthack shadow hunter with nothing more serious than bruised knuckles and a few minor cuts, the assembled experts began to realize they were dealing with something far more significant than a simple classroom accident. Dr. Kethanear, the university's head of xenobiological studies, arrived within minutes of the first emergency call. The elderly Thurian's massive frame and scarred hide marked him as one of the few individuals in the galactic academic community who had personal experience with genuinely dangerous situations. His species' homeworld was classified as a Class 8 hostile environment, and Thurians had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most respected security specialists through hard-won experience with planetary hazards. Impossible was Dr. Kithanear's first assessment as he reviewed the preliminary reports. Vorthack shadow hunters don't lose combat encounters. Ever. In 300 years of documented contact with their species, there's never been a recorded instance of one being defeated by biological means alone. Professor Veltar, still visibly shaken by the day's events, gestured toward Marcus with one trembling tendril. The human student engaged the specimen in direct combat and systematically neutralized its hunting capabilities through kinetic force application. My recordings show tactical awareness and combat reflexes that exceeded the Vorthack's response capabilities. Marcus endured their scientific discussion with growing discomfort. He had spent 2 years trying to blend in with galactic academic culture, suppressing the aggressive instincts that made other species uncomfortable and working to prove that humans could function peacefully in civilized society. Now he was being analyzed like a laboratory specimen, with experts debating his combat performance in clinical terms that stripped away any recognition of his humanity. The bio readings are fascinating, Dr. Kithanear continued, his massive hands manipulating holographic displays that showed Marcus's physiological responses during the encounter. Human adrenaline production increased by nearly 400%, muscle fiber tension peaked at levels that should have caused structural damage, and neural activity in the combat processing centers reached thresholds I've only seen in dedicated military specialists. Around the lecture hall, Marcus's fellow students watched the proceedings with expressions ranging from awe to terror. The Corvin students had clustered together in their traditional protective formation, their chemical communications creating a complex symphony of sense that Marcus's enhanced human olfactory systems could interpret as mixtures of fear, respect, and confusion. The Etherian crystalline beings were maintaining harmonic resonances in minor keys that felt like funeral dirges, while the Zilithians appeared to be conducting some form of group meditation to process the emotional trauma of witnessing actual violence. Zixera, the small Tecton student who had been the Vorthack's intended first victim, approached Marcus with hesitant steps. Her cybernetic implants were still sparking occasionally as her systems recovered from the overload caused by her terror response. But her large, luminous eyes held an expression that Marcus had never seen directed at him before. "You saved my life," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the bustling activity of the emergency response teams. "The Predator was going to kill me, and you stopped it." Marcus felt something shift in his chest as he looked down at the diminutive being who barely reached his waist. For 2 years, his interactions with other students had been cordial but distant, marked by the underlying tension that came from their instinctive recognition of humans as dangerous. This was the first time anyone had spoken to him with genuine gratitude rather than fearful respect. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he replied, which caused several nearby specialists to pause in their work and stare at him with expressions of disbelief. Dr. Kithanear's gruff laugh filled the lecture hall. "No, young human, they would not have. What you did today contradicts fundamental assumptions about the nature of predator-prey relationships. Most species would have been paralyzed by fear or would have attempted to flee. You chose to engage a superior predator in direct combat to protect individuals you barely know. That behavior pattern is so statistically unusual that our psychological models don't even account for it." The academic discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Administrator Zeth Tak, the highest-ranking official at Kepler Interspecies University. The ancient Aquarian's tentacles writhed with barely controlled agitation as she surveyed the damaged lecture hall and the unconscious Vorthack that was being prepared for transport to the medical facilities. Explanation, she demanded in the clipped, efficient manner that had made her legendary throughout the galactic education system. How did a Class 15 Predator specimen breach containment during a routine academic demonstration? Professor Veltar's sensory tendrils darkened with embarrassment as she responded. The biofield generators experienced cascade failure when the specimen activated previously unknown psionic capabilities. The containment protocols were insufficient for a Vorthack operating at full defensive capacity, and the neutralization of the threat Administrator Zeth Talk's massive eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him acutely aware of being evaluated by something that had survived for centuries in the galaxy's political and academic hierarchies. The human student engaged in direct combat and defeated the specimen through superior tactics and physical capabilities, Dr. Kethanar reported, his voice carrying a note of professional admiration that surprised everyone in the room. The encounter provides unprecedented data on human combat psychology and physiological capabilities under extreme stress conditions. Administrator Zeth Talk was silent for a long moment, her tentacles moving in complex patterns that Marcus had learned to recognize as deep thought among Aquarian individuals. When she finally spoke, her words carried implications that would reverberate throughout the galactic community for years to come. This incident will be classified as a significant xenobiological event and reported to the Galactic Council for review, she announced. All participants will be interviewed by specialized personnel, and the human student will be required to submit to comprehensive physiological and psychological evaluation to determine the implications of this encounter for human integration into galactic society. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized what this meant. The careful balance he had maintained for 2 years, the gradual progress toward acceptance and normal social interaction, was about to be shattered by official scrutiny that would mark him as either a dangerous anomaly or a fascinating research subject. Either outcome would make his dream of becoming a respected xenobiologist effectively impossible. But before he could voice his concerns, something unexpected happened. Zixera stepped forward, her small frame somehow managing to project defiance despite her species' naturally submissive body language. Administrator Zeth Talk, she said formally, I request permission to speak on behalf of the human student Marcus Chun. The ancient Aquarian's eye stalks swiveled to focus on the diminutive Tecton with surprise. Permission granted, Student Zixera. What would you like to say? Marcus saved my life and protected our entire class from a threat that would have killed many of us before security could respond, Zixera stated clearly. He demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and selflessness that this university claims to value in its students. Any evaluation of his actions should recognize that he chose to risk his own safety to protect others, not to demonstrate superiority or aggression. Her words triggered a response that Marcus hadn't expected. One by one, his fellow students began stepping forward to add their voices to Zixera's statement. The Corvin cluster clicked and chittered in unison, their chemical communications carrying messages of support and gratitude. The Etherian beings shifted their harmonic resonances to triumphant major keys that made the damaged walls ring like bells. Even the normally reserved Zalithians added their melodious voices to the growing chorus of testimony. For the first time since the encounter began, Marcus felt his eyes burning with emotions that had nothing to do with adrenaline or combat stress. His fellow students, the same individuals who had spent 2 years maintaining careful distance from the dangerous human in their midst, were publicly defending him to university administration. They were acknowledging that his capacity for violence had been used to protect rather than threaten them. Professor Veltar's voice added weight to the student's testimony. The human's actions during this encounter demonstrate advanced tactical thinking, remarkable physical capabilities, and, most importantly, a moral framework that prioritizes the protection of others over personal safety. These are exactly the qualities we hope to develop in students, regardless of their species of origin. Dr. Kethanar nodded his massive head in agreement. The psychological profile indicated by the human's behavior suggests strong social bonding instincts and protective responses toward perceived group members. Rather than indicating danger to the university community, this incident demonstrates that humans may be naturally inclined to serve as protectors for more vulnerable species. Administrator Zethtalk absorbed all of this input with the careful consideration that had made her one of the galaxy's most respected academic leaders. Her tentacles continued their complex movements as she processed not just the immediate implications of the incident, but the broader questions it raised about human integration into galactic society. The evaluation will proceed as planned, she finally announced, but it will focus on understanding human capabilities and psychology rather than determining threat levels. This incident has provided us with unprecedented data about how Deathworld species might function within our academic and social structures. She paused and looked directly at Marcus with an expression that might have been approval. Student Chun, your actions today have demonstrated that the most important lessons in xenobiology cannot be learned from textbooks or laboratory specimens. Sometimes the greatest understanding comes from direct experience with the forces that shape life throughout the galaxy. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as he realized that this incident, rather than ending his academic career, might actually open new doors for human students throughout the university system. His fellow students were already looking at him differently, not with the fearful respect he had grown accustomed to, but with genuine appreciation for abilities that could be used to protect rather than threaten. As the emergency teams finished securing the unconscious Vorthak and began cleaning up the damaged lecture hall, Marcus reflected on how much had changed in the span of a single class period. He was no longer just a dangerous anomaly to be tolerated and carefully monitored. He had become something that the galactic community had never encountered before. A Deathworlder who used his lethal capabilities to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The lesson that Professor Veltar had planned to teach about predator-prey relationships had been delivered, but not in any way she had expected. The galaxy was about to learn that the most dangerous predators could sometimes become the most reliable guardians. 3 months after the incident in Lecture Hall Sigma 7, Marcus Chun stood before the assembled delegates of the Galactic Education Council, addressing representatives from over 200 species about the future of interspecies academic cooperation. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same violent encounter that he had feared would end his academic career had instead made him one of the most requested speakers in the galaxy. The Great Assembly Hall of Kepler Station could hold nearly 10,000 beings, and every seat was occupied. Floating platforms accommodated species that required specialized atmospheric conditions, while massive holographic displays allowed participants from distant star systems to observe the proceedings in real time. The diversity was breathtaking, representing every major civilizational group in known space. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for this presentation, working with Professor Veltar and a team of xenopsychologists to analyze the implications of what had become known as the Vorthak incident. Their findings had challenged fundamental assumptions about predator evolution, social cooperation, and the potential for Deathworld species to integrate peacefully into galactic civilization. Honored delegates, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic systems. 3 months ago, I believe that the greatest challenge facing human students in galactic institutions was overcoming the fear and suspicion that our evolutionary background generated among other species. I thought that if I could just suppress my aggressive instincts and demonstrate peaceful intentions, I could eventually earn acceptance and respect. He paused, looking out over the sea of alien faces that represented nearly every form of intelligence that had emerged in their corner of the galaxy. Some watched him with obvious fascination, others with barely concealed nervousness, but all with the intense attention that came from recognizing they were witnessing something historically significant. I was wrong, Marcus continued. The real challenge wasn't suppressing what made me human. It was learning how to use those same qualities in service of values that all civilized species share. When faced with a threat to my classmates, I didn't succeed because I overcame my nature as a Deathworlder. I succeeded because I embraced it. The holographic displays around the hall showed footage from Professor Veltar's recording equipment, carefully edited to demonstrate the tactical progression of the encounter without glorifying the violence. The assembled delegates watched in silence as Marcus systematically dismantled the Vorthax hunting patterns through pure kinetic force and strategic thinking. Dr. Kethanar rose from his position in the Thurian delegation section. The analysis of this encounter has revealed combat capabilities that exceed our previous understanding of human physiology and psychology. More importantly, it has demonstrated behavioral patterns that suggest humans may possess natural protective instincts toward perceived group members, regardless of species differences. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement of the Thurian xenobiologist's support. Over the past 3 months, Dr. Kethanar had become one of his strongest advocates, arguing that human students should be integrated into galactic security programs rather than restricted to purely academic roles. The data supports a remarkable conclusion, Dr. Kethanar continued. Humans appear to be naturally suited for roles as protectors and guardians for more vulnerable species. Their capacity for violence, which has traditionally been viewed as a threat to galactic stability, may actually represent a unique resource for protecting civilian populations from planetary hazards and predatory threats. A ripple of discussion passed through the assembled delegates as they processed the implications of this assessment. For centuries, galactic civilization had operated on the principle that dangerous species should be contained and monitored rather than integrated into broader society. The suggestion that humans might actually enhance security rather than threaten it represented a fundamental shift in xenopolitical thinking. Ambassador Silandra of the Zilithian Council rose gracefully to address the assembly. Her species' reputation for wisdom and emotional insight gave her words special weight among the delegates. The Zilithian Collective has completed an extensive empathic analysis of the human student's psychological state during the encounter. Our findings indicate that his primary emotional drivers were protective instincts and concern for his classmates' welfare, not aggressive dominance or territorial behavior. She gestured toward Marcus with one elegant tendril. The human experienced genuine distress at the thought of harm coming to beings he had known for only 2 years. This level of interspecies empathy and protective bonding is unprecedented in our psychological databases. It suggests that humans may be uniquely capable of forming meaningful social connections across species barriers. Marcus felt a familiar warmth in his chest as he remembered the support his fellow students had shown during the immediate aftermath of the incident. Zixera had become one of his closest friends, often seeking his advice on engineering problems and sharing stories about her homeworld. The Corvin students had incorporated him into their social cluster, teaching him the complex chemical communication patterns that served as their equivalent of casual conversation. Most remarkably, even species that had no previous contact with humans had begun requesting exchanges and collaborative programs. The University of Altair had established the first human-Aquarian joint research initiative, focusing on comparative studies of high-pressure environment adaptation. The Crystalline Academies of Shaun had proposed a cultural exchange program that would allow human students to study resonance-based communication techniques. The educational applications are particularly promising, Professor Veltar announced as she took her position at the speaker's podium. Human students have demonstrated remarkable ability to understand predator psychology and behavior patterns that remain mysterious to garden world species. Their insights have already led to breakthrough discoveries in xenobiology, comparative psychology, and planetary defense strategies. The holographic displays shifted to show academic papers that had emerged from the incident analysis. Marcus's first-hand account of Vorthack hunting psychology had been combined with Professor Veltar's scientific observations to produce research that was revolutionizing understanding of apex predator behavior throughout the galaxy. But perhaps the most significant development was the response from human students at universities across known space. Word of Marcus's successful defense of his classmates had spread through human communication networks within days, inspiring a wave of applications to galactic academic institutions that had previously seen minimal human enrollment. Administrator Zeth Talk's voice carried across the assembly hall as she presented the final component of the Council's recommendations. Based on our analysis of the Vorthack incident and subsequent research into human psychology and capabilities, the Galactic Education Council proposes the establishment of the Interspecies Protection Corps, a joint organization staffed primarily by volunteers from Deathworld species who wish to serve as guardians for academic expeditions, research stations, and civilian colonies in hazardous environments. The proposal sent excited ripples through the assembled delegates. For the first time in galactic history, there was a concrete plan for utilizing the unique capabilities of dangerous species in constructive roles that would benefit all of galactic civilization. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he realized that his moment of instinctive action in defense of his classmates had opened doors not just for himself, but for his entire species. Human students would no longer be viewed as dangerous anomalies to be tolerated, but as valuable partners whose unique perspectives and capabilities could enhance the safety and knowledge of the entire galactic community. The human student success in academic environments has demonstrated that Deathworld species can not only coexist peacefully with Garden World civilizations, but can actively contribute to their protection and advancement, Administrator Zeth Talk concluded. We recommend the immediate expansion of human enrollment quotas at all galactic academic institutions and the development of specialized curricula that take advantage of their unique evolutionary adaptations. As the formal session concluded and delegates began forming smaller discussion groups to work out implementation details, Marcus found himself surrounded by beings from species he had never encountered before. They asked questions about human culture, psychology, and capabilities with the genuine curiosity of scholars rather than the fearful suspicion he had grown accustomed to. Zixera appeared at his elbow, her cybernetic implants gleaming as she navigated the crowd with typical Tecton efficiency. "You know this is going to change everything, right?" she said quietly. "Not just for humans, but for every species that's been classified as potentially dangerous. You've proven that being a predator doesn't make you a threat to civilization." Marcus smiled as he watched the animated discussions taking place around them. Representatives from warrior cultures were talking with peaceful agricultural civilizations about joint security initiatives. Academic institutions were planning exchange programs that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The rigid classifications that had kept dangerous species isolated from mainstream galactic society were beginning to break down. "I just did what anyone would have done," Marcus replied, echoing his words from that chaotic day in Lecture Hall Sigma 7. Zixera laughed, a sound like silver bells that made several nearby ethereal shift to harmonizing frequencies in appreciation. That's exactly the point. What you think of as normal human behavior, protecting others at personal risk, fighting impossible odds to save people you care about, refusing to give up when everything seems hopeless. That's not normal for most of us. It's extraordinary, and it's exactly what the galaxy needs. As they made their way through the crowd toward the reception area where his fellow students were waiting to celebrate, Marcus reflected on how much his understanding of his own humanity had changed. For most of his life, he had seen his aggressive instincts and capacity for violence as obstacles to overcome in order to fit into civilized society. Now he understood that these same qualities, properly directed and controlled, were exactly what made him valuable to that society. His willingness to fight when others couldn't, his refusal to yield in the face of impossible odds, his instinctive drive to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. These weren't bugs in human programming that needed to be fixed. They were features that could make the galaxy a safer place for everyone. The conversation around them gradually shifted from formal diplomatic language to the enthusiastic chatter of beings who were excited about new possibilities. Marcus heard fragments of discussion about joint research projects, cultural exchange programs, and collaborative defense initiatives that would have been impossible before the Vorthack incident forced the galactic community to reconsider their assumptions about predator species. Professor Veltar appeared beside them, her sensory tendrils bright with satisfaction. Marcus, I wanted you to know that applications for next semester's advanced xenobiology course have increased by 400%. Apparently, word has spread that my classes provide genuinely practical education in predator psychology. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of personal warmth that went beyond academic interest. More importantly, 12 different species have requested human teaching assistance for their most challenging field research programs. They specifically want individuals who can provide security and tactical support in hazardous environments while maintaining academic standards and research integrity. Marcus felt a moment of genuine wonder as he realized the implications of her words. Human students wouldn't just be tolerated in galactic academic institutions. They would be actively sought out for their unique capabilities. The same evolutionary background that had made him an object of fear and suspicion was becoming a qualification for opportunities that most galactic citizens couldn't even imagine attempting. As the formal proceedings concluded and the great assembly hall gradually emptied, Marcus found himself standing with his friends and colleagues in the quiet that followed the storm of galactic attention. The fear and isolation that had characterized his first 2 years at the university seemed like memories from another lifetime. Looking out through the massive viewports at the stars beyond Kepler Station, Marcus understood that this was just the beginning. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers that garden world species couldn't comprehend, let alone survive. But it was also full of wonders and opportunities for those brave enough to face the unknown. And if there was one thing that millions of years of surviving on a death world had taught humanity, it was that the unknown was just another challenge to overcome through courage, intelligence, and the kind of stubborn refusal to give up that had carried his species from the caves of Africa to the stars themselves. The lesson that had begun with a predator in a classroom had evolved into something much larger. A new understanding of how different species could work together to build a galaxy where everyone could thrive, protected by those who had learned to embrace their nature as guardians rather than suppress it as a threat. Marcus Chun, Deathworlder and Defender, smiled as he contemplated the adventures that awaited in a universe that finally understood what humans had always known, Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was refuse to be afraid.